Thanks for tuning in. I'm Adrian Segura, sitting in for Andy Zopp, and this is a special edition of Chicago Newsroom 2.0, the state of education in Chicago. This week, we'll sit one-on-one with Daniel Anello, CEO of Kids First Chicago, who will join me to talk about all things CPS budget. We'll have a special roundtable with the Academy for Local Leadership's Executive Director, Bridget and CPS School Board members Rhymefest and Carlos Rivas to talk about the CPS superintendent search. Finally, we'll be joined by Chicago Public Schools educators Keishonda Simms, Dara Miller, Layla Truehaft-Ali, and Daniel Jackson to talk about teaching in today's climate, as well as the recently ratified CTU contract and more. Lots to cover, and it all begins on the other side of this short break. Stay with us.
Every community has a story, a pulse, a voice waiting to be heard. At CAN TV, we bring these stories to life, from the heart of Chicago to your living room. Join us in supporting hyper-local television. Your backing helps us cover what matters directly in our communities, unfiltered and upfront. Help tell the important stories of our communities. Become a program underwriter today.
One-on-one this week, we turn our attention to Chicago Public Schools budgets. Last week, the Chicago Principals and Administrators Association strongly criticized Chicago Public Schools CEO Pedro Martinez's budget planning for the upcoming school year, labeling it as magical and false. In a letter, the Principals Union claims the proposed school-level budgets released Thursday are based on unrealistic assumptions, including increased state funding, full federal funding, and the unlikely liquidation of all of the city's tax increment financing districts. CPS, however, defends its budget plan as strategic and responsible, urging principals to collaborate in advocating for existing funds to be directed to the school district. While CPS acknowledges it doesn't expect the city to liquidate all TIFs, it anticipates a $600 million reimbursement. The amount it would receive without TIFs, this expectation is also viewed as unlikely by the city, which argues that schools already benefit from TIFs and even suggests CPS owes the city money. Adding to the turmoil, School Board President Sean Hardin has also criticized Martinez's budget proposals as unsatisfactory and incomplete. Principals are concerned about the delayed release of the budget information, which could hinder staffing and program decisions. Furthermore, there's internal conflict regarding the search for an interim CEO to replace the outgoing Martinez, with some believing the board president is trying to install the mayor's chief of staff, who lacks the required superintendent's license. The Principals Association warns that the district's financial state and the ongoing leadership transition create a challenging environment. Joining me to talk about the CPS budget is Daniel Anello, CEO of Kids First Chicago. Daniel, welcome to the newsroom.
Thank you.
So, considering the Chicago Principals and Administrators' concerns about magical and false nature of the proposed CPS budget, particularly the reliance on potentially unrealized state and federal funding and the unlikely liquidation of TIFs, what are your thoughts on the feasibility and potential impact of this budget on schools in their planning for the upcoming academic year?
So, first of all, Kids for Chicago, we stump for parents is the easiest way to say it. We're consultants for parents, essentially, in a nutshell. But our model is to be deferential to parents in a school district that routinely doesn't have them in the conversation in a way that respects and gives them the dignity that they deserve in terms of their expertise on their own children. And if you think about parents, like, their intrinsic motivation is their own children's opportunity. So we want them in the conversation. And as you ask me, like, what are my thoughts on all of these moving parts? Like, my first thought is, like, we need to break this down and bring it to our parent advisory board and to our parent community and really get their take on what they think is important to happen here. And that's what we've been doing all along, even with some of these other conversations. When I think about just everything you went through in terms of state funding, federal funding, the $600 million TIF surplus piece that CPS would get if there was a $1.2 billion surplus scoop, which is what would take, and I can come back to that. I worry that just the back and forth is really a huge challenge for families and principals and schools generally when you're trying to set up your budget and think about what you're going to do in the future kind of year, you don't need to have that kind of uncertainty if you're really trying to understand what you're going to have and how you avoid mid-year cuts or other potential problematic hazards. And from a family standpoint, from a parent standpoint, like that's a huge challenge. When you get into the actual specifics of the budget, I feel like there have been some reports and responses to it. It's really hard to see a $600 million TIF surplus go to the school district when this year they got $298 million. We'll round up to $300 million, and that was the largest that the city's ever allocated. And for the average person, TIFs are kind of this foreign thing, but essentially the surplus, which has to be at least $1.2 billion based on the CPS budget, 52% of that surplus is allocated to CPS. Like they have it's their money, but the way it would get distributed is that city council has to decide whether or not they're going to issue a portion of that surplus. So in order for CPS to have gotten the 300 that they got this year, it was because they issued 600 to the city. That's still the largest that they've issued in modern history. So now to say that it's going to be double that, which leaves CPS with a deficit of $229 million rather than $529 million, that's a big question mark.
So I guess in your experience, how critical is a collaborative financial relationship between the district and the city for the overall stability and the success, frankly, of our public education system in Chicago?
I mean, it's everything, right? Like if you can't trust the numbers from either side, or if there is going to be a fight between the city and the district on a pension payment, like all of this, at the end of the day, the schools themselves, the families that are going to these schools are left with incredible uncertainty about where the money is going to be or where it's not. And, if the money doesn't actually materialize at the end of the day, there's only so many options that Chicago Public Schools has in order to kind of navigate that.
I guess to that end, what strategies could foster a more aligned approach to budgeting?
Man, I mean, I think that the biggest thing is like, how do you get like real truth tellers to kind of unpack what the realities are in terms of the budget, right? Right now, I think that there's still a lot of political kind of friction between the city and CPS. I think that some of that will shift as we see new leadership kind of come in. But you also don't want it to be a one-sided, hey, we want this to be, I mean, one of the things that our parents were actually staunchly opposed to was this idea of, at the time, sending $175 million of that pension payment back to the city when they were just about to sign a new teacher's contract, and the district needed those dollars to pay for the new teacher's contract. And the main reason was they didn't want to see a loan get taken out because they had seen, many of them had been children in the school district when the last time, the piper came and said, hey, we need to collect our money, and they were left losing all of their extra programming, seeing furlough days, like all the things that happen when you don't manage the dollars responsibly. I think that the partnership between CPS and the city is one where they have to actually realize that they can't function without each other. It's kind of like the relationship between Chicago and Illinois, and recognize that even if CPS can't pay its bills, the buck actually stops with the city at some point, right? Like that's who's going to be left picking up the pieces. So, we have to figure this out. I'm hopeful that we're heading into a new era where the communication between city and CPS will be in a place where it actually is productive in terms of thinking through. And I think it's really important for this 21-member school board to be getting really sound facts around the budget and be able to trust where those facts are coming from, because what you don't want is 21 members who are arguing with different sets of facts coming from different places.
I guess given the delayed release of school level budgets, the uncertainty surrounding the financial projections, things that you just raised up, what immediate challenges do you anticipate principals, local school councils, which I know Kids First has partnered with in the past, what challenges do you anticipate they'll face in making crucial staffing and program decisions for next school year?
So if I'm a principal right now or school leader, and this is the same thing for parents who are just thinking about it, it's a more downstream. I'm wondering how real the budget is. And if the deficit is actually larger than what they're saying, if the city is not going to reliably allocate $600 million in TIF surplus funding to the district, that leaves a pretty sizable hole in the budget. And prudent principals are probably factoring that in. They're saying, hey, I know they're telling me that this is the budget for my school, but I'm a little bit nervous that it's not going to come through, and so therefore I'm not going to hire for these 2 positions, or I'm going to leave this place vacant, or I'm not going to have this particular program. And it's a little bit of a guessing game, because how do you figure out exactly what that dollar amount is? And at the end of the day, if the money does come through, which is, I think, maybe hopeful, then you just shortchanged your school for an entire year. Now, if you bet on the money arriving, because this, you're like, okay, I'm going to trust that this is actually where the budget is, and you hire and staff up for that, then what happens mid-year when you find out that those dollars are not actually materializing? Then we're talking about cuts, right? So.
Yeah. And I guess to that end, what advice would you offer school leaders that are going to be potentially navigating this period of financial ambiguity?
I think it's really important from an advocacy standpoint for school leaders to put pressure on the city and on the administration here to get them, to your point, to work together to come up with a comprehensive, collaboratively, what is this actually going to look like next year? What is the realistic allocation that we can expect from the city? Is it $300 million? Is it more than that in terms of TIF allocation? I don't think we can potentially expect more from the state in terms of the allocation that they've been giving every year, in terms of the increase in their evidence-based funding formula, because every year we see an increase for folks who don't know that. I think the conversation about whether or not the federal government is going to allocate more dollars, we see what's going on at the federal level. I think that that's potentially wishful thinking. So how do we actually have principals and others, parents, everyone say, you guys need to figure this out and tell us what the number is actually going to be, and we need to be able to trust it is coming from both of you.
Danny, I appreciate the time that you took today to connect on this topic. I'm sure topics that Kids First Chicago engages with on a variety of fronts. So on the other side of the break, we'll look at the CPS CEO search with the Academy for Local Leadership Executive Director Bridget Lee and CPS School Board members Rhymefest and Carlos Rivas. Stay with us.
Hi, I'm Dr. Norcott. On the next episode of Be Well, we'll unpack the realities of family dysfunction and how setting boundaries can be a powerful step toward healing with my guest, Dr. Neka Onyezia. Join the conversation on CAN TV, Cable Channel 19, or stream live on cantv.org or on the CAN TV Plus app. Elevated conversation and storytelling. Experience the power of community television.
CAN TV is the lens through which Chicago's stories are told, harnessing the unifying power of community television. With CAN TV On Demand, immerse yourself in the richness of our city through exclusive stories and programs tailored just for you, connecting you to the heartbeats of our streets, the voices of our people, and the spirit that makes Chicago unique. Discover the strength of your community on CAN TV On Demand.
This week on the Roundtable, we're diving into a timely conversation regarding the CPS superintendent search. Last month, the CPS Board of Education unanimously voted to approve a measure that would require the CPS CEO to hold a state superintendent's license. Now, that measure stands challenged. Last week, 30 Chicago City Council members and City Clerk Ana Valencia urged the Chicago Board of Education to adhere to its resolution requiring the next CPS CEO to possess a state superintendent's license. All of this comes amid reports that Mayor Brandon Johnson is pushing for his Chief of Staff, Cristina Pasiones-Zayas, who does not have this license, to become the interim CEO, replacing the outgoing CEO, Pedro Martinez. The letter from the Alderpeople emphasizes that educators have long desired a leader with educational experience and that the interests of students, parents, and teachers should outweigh political considerations. This situation follows previous clashes between Martinez and Johnson over district finances. Some elected school board members, like Jennifer Custer and Rhymefest Smith, who introduced the licensing resolution, are also pushing back against the mayor's apparent efforts to bypass the requirement, viewing it as a threat to the board's independence. Mayor Johnson has stated the importance of hiring someone who understands the district's direction. The Board of Education's next meeting is scheduled for May 29th. Joining me to talk about this measure and the search process are Bridget Lee, Executive Director of the Academy of Local Leadership, All Chicago, and board members Che Rhymefest and Carlos Rivas. Welcome, everyone. Let's dive right in. The City Council emphasized the importance of a licensed superintendent for the CEO role. Board member Rhymefest, you've been vocal about this requirement, stating it's about qualifications, not politics. Can you elaborate on the core educational values you believe are at stake in this debate and why it's so important?
Of course. So that's a wonderful question you're asking, because it's not about politics. It's actually about the gold standard of education defined by the state of Illinois. So in the state of Illinois, in every district in Illinois, the head of schools is defined as a superintendent. We got CEO 35 years ago as a daily policy, a mayor daily practice, and even our mayor has, for the last 20 years, fought against CEOs in the face of what students deserve. I'll just say it like this. We don't want, and we have people that would never advocate for a principal not to have a principal license, or a teacher not to have a license. The superintendent is over 622 schools, not one. So if we're going to have that standard and look to the state to equitably fund our students with what they deserve, we have to start with adults at the top with a gold standard of superintendent, and then we can have the expectation of our students to meet gold standards and our teachers.
Board Member Rivas, given the complexities of Chicago's political landscape and the various stakeholders involved, how do you see the Board of Education balancing the need for a qualified educational leader with the mayor's vision for the district, and what are the key considerations in that process?
You know, one of the things that we've talked about a lot, those of us elected and appointed on the board, is the fact that we need board independence. We are at a critical juncture where we have lots of needs for our schools, and we have lots of challenges here at our city and at the state level. And I think one critical way for us to be able to work together is to ensure that we're allowed to operate independently, and also make sure that we're working collaboratively and together with our city and state counterparts. We have been elected by the people of the city of Chicago, and we're here to be able to ensure that their voice is at the table. And so those of us that are elected and are able to talk about the needs of our communities are out there talking to community residents about those wants and desires. And so we know that our community wants us to have a strong educational system in Chicago, and we know that they want us to be able to work collaboratively. And that's all that, Member Smith and I have been working toward the last few months, is learning this work, making sure that we're out and listening to community, because community voice is at the heart of what we're doing.
And on that point, Bridget, clearly there's some tension between the board, the mayor, and even the city council regarding the search. How can CPS foster a more collaborative relationship among these entities to ensure a smooth transition and a unified vision for the district's future?
I think that starts with acknowledging a really big asset in Chicago, right? Which is all of those groups that you mentioned, all of our community members have a shared goal. We want our kids to be thriving. We want our schools to be strong, right? So when we start there, there's a lot to build on. And I think, one thing I hold true is that to be clear is to be kind. And I feel like we're at this point of transition where it makes sense that things are messy, right? We're moving from what was once a fully appointed board. There was a lot of synergy between an appointed board and a CEO and the mayor. And we're now in this middle stage where we have a hybrid board, right? Partially elected, partially appointed. And so it makes sense that roles and responsibilities are a little messy. But I'm hopeful that once we move into the fully elected board, we'll really be able to get clear on who is responsible for what. And what I would want folks to know is that the board is ultimately responsible for hiring and evaluating the CEO. And when you are clear on your role, right, that is where you can start to build trust. And so I think I have a lot of optimism as we move forward and we fully implement this policy, that we'll really be able to settle into who is responsible for what, who makes which decisions, and that's an opportunity to build upon.
So we know that community engagement is a key component of the search, and every board member, from my understanding, is doing some level of engagement. I know Board Member Rhymefest, you had an event yesterday. Board Member Rivas, you're going to have an event later on today. I'm curious, beyond community meetings and surveys, how can we ensure that the voices of marginalized communities, including parents and students and teachers, are not only heard, but also meaningfully influence the selection process?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We had a meeting yesterday at Chicago Agricultural High School, and it was a collaboration between districts 9 and 10. So there were appointeds and electeds at this event that had over 116 community members there. That's how we hold ourselves accountable, by listening to the communities whose voices were fought for. So, I am the manifestation of Mayor Brandon Johnson's fight for an elected board. I am the manifestation of CTU's fight for an elected board. When they look at us, they're looking at the voice of the community speaking through the people that they elected. And I think as long as we hold true to the values of the people who had those fights and the values of the people who are telling us what they want for their schools, the city will be just fine.
Board Member Rivas, I don't know if there's anything you'd add to just kind of as you're thinking about your own events and the centering community perspective in the search process, if there's anything you'd add to.
Yeah, I think I'll add that, it's really important for us to ensure that we're getting it out to all parts of the city, but also ensuring that we're equitable in terms of how we're reaching out to families, right? It's we talked about the survey, that's one way. We're talking about these community meetings, and in our community meetings, we're making sure that for my district, where 85% of the children in my district are Latino, making sure that we're providing opportunities in Spanish so that our Spanish-speaking parents can participate. And we need to think of ways of how we can interact with, our new migrant community that may be speaking multiple different languages. So there's lots of opportunities for us to be able to engage and find ways for us to be able to engage with folks that didn't necessarily engage with us in the past. All of last year, I talked so much about authentic community engagement. Authentic community engagement doesn't mean we're holding 1, 2, 3 meetings virtually or at one location and that's it. I believe authentic community engagement looks like what we're doing right now, which is we have 11 meetings planned. We have surveys, we've done focus groups. We're doing lots more to be able to bring in that voice that we talked about, those teachers, administrators, parents, and then folks, just regular residents when they're coming to our community events. You don't need to be a parent with a child in the district to have an opinion about who should be the next leader of our school district.
Yeah. And I just want to add, I'm going to Carlos's event tonight. Tomorrow night, we're doing another community gathering in South Shore, only to talk about counselors and the role of counselors, elevating student voice, So these are things that the community has never seen a school board this dynamic, where now the community even gets to know what a school board member does. We get to define that.
On that point, Bridget, so much of the work that you do at All Chicago is helping not only recruit and train prospective board members, show them what a school board member does, but it's also supporting the existing board. I'm curious, as we think about an interim CEO and then eventually the permanent superintendent getting placed, that CEO is going to face some immediate challenges. And many of the topics you covered through All Chicago, things like budget shortfalls and the need to address ongoing concerns about school level budgets. What do you think the first 100 days should look like for the next superintendent?
I think that's something that we're actually discovering through these community meetings that we're having now, right? Because ultimately, if you look at the CPS org chart, which many folks maybe haven't seen it, but it's out there, you'll see that the residents of Chicago are actually at the top of that org chart. It's not the CEO or superintendent, it's not the board, it's not the mayor. And so I've been really excited to partner with board members on these community engagement events because yes, they're about what people want to see in the next leader, but families are showing up and they're really telling us what is important to them, what is important to their students. And those themes cross geographical lines, they cross district boundaries, and they're things like, folks want their young people to be strong readers and to have access to art and sports, right? And to be safe and joyful at school. And so if we're listening to those things, I think that builds the blueprint for what's most important in those first 100 days. And what I will say is when we go out there, folks aren't sharing about politics or budgets or Springfield. Yes, those things are really important and they're factors, but I think if we can begin to really focus on what the community is saying, our priorities, and elevate those things and have constructive, critical conversations about those things, that is the blueprint. Because it's really hard to, argue about politics when you have a student who's showing you their artwork or a parent who is sharing about the success of their young person. So I think that's where we start.
I mean, to that end, I think the politics piece always gets creates the noise in the echo chamber. How can the board, board member Rhymefest, how can the board maintain its autonomy and ensure that its decisions are driven by the best interests of students, even in the face of potential political pressure?
Well, I believe every board member has to face our duty with student-centered governance that puts principle over personalities. And, we were elected to listen to the public, but not only be transparent and listen to our constituents, but use evidence-based solutions, which means we have to look at the data and see what the data says. We have to lean into the complexity of the data. And that's where our solutions come from, our relationships, our conversations with each other. This is a independent municipal body. And I think what I believe is we're going through those growing pains of, how do we, as a board, how do we come up with our own evidence-based solutions and not what City Hall says the thing is, or another municipal body says? People were used to using the schools how they wanted for their own gain. But I do believe, and here's my evidence, when you look at this superintendent's resolution, not only was Jenny Custer, board member Custer, a co-sponsor, this superintendent's resolution was co-sponsored by board member Anusha Thattakara. It was co-sponsored by board member Ebony DeBerry. And they're staying strong that they believe in the resolution, the values of the resolution they sponsor. So just because someone is appointed doesn't mean I automatically think they're not going to take the side of students. One of the things I've learned about this board in the 5 months I've been on it, every board member cares about students. As long as we keep students at the center and data at the helm, we're going to do the right things.
A quick pivot, because I do know that in addition to the superintendent search, school level budgets were released, albeit a little bit late. In that delayed release of school level budgets has caused some concern amongst principals, raising the question, how is the board addressing these delays? And what steps are being taken to ensure that schools have the resources and, most importantly, the right information that they need to effectively plan for the upcoming school year? Board Member Rivas, any thoughts on the delay and the impact that that's having on school leaders and principals?
Yeah, definitely. There was a lot of things that delayed the school budgets coming out. One of the big things was the fact that, we didn't have finalized contracts to understand what was it that we were going to be paying for next year in the CTU contract. We're still negotiating the CPAA contract with our principals and school administrators. So there's lots of costs that are just millions upon millions of dollars, right? And so we need to take that into consideration when we're thinking next year's budget. And so one of the things that I stress with our board when talking to other board members is the fact that we need to trust the people that we've hired, right? The experts that we've hired to be able to do this work. And so I trust our budget office in what they're letting us know around the deficits, how we're going to be thinking about those deficits. And so what we need to do now as a board, we know what our projected deficit is for next school year. Me and Member Smith have to do the advocating along with the full board. We need to talk not only to the city to ensure that we have a release of TIF funds for us for next year, more than what we had this year. We need to have a really solid plan to be able to go down to Springfield. And that actually comes with us having a unified message. And so that resolution that we passed unanimously, I think shows how we are a unified board. We can take that message down to Springfield and say, we are a board that's looking for independence and support to ensure that some of the very historical inequities that exist in funding for the Chicago Public Schools are fixed at the state and city level to ensure that we have the resources needed to have thriving schools.
Bridget, this one's, I think similar, but a little bit of a tangent. Given the current national debate about education, including issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, how should the board ensure that the next CPS superintendent is equipped to navigate these complex issues and foster a school environment that's both welcoming and supportive for students?
I think it's continuing to honestly focus locally, right? There's going to be a lot coming out of the White House and media, and those things can't be ignored, but there's a lot of work to do, like Carlos just mentioned, at the local level in ensuring that our students here have what they need. And so, I think one thing I'm appreciative of is Carlos did our program, right? And we started the All Chicago program because we want this board to win and succeed. And to us, the board winning and succeeding means that our students are winning and succeeding. So yes, there is a lot on the national front that we have to deal with. And I think that this board is focused on the right things right now, which is how do we make sure that our students and our teachers and our principals have what they need today and next year.
I mean, I guess, with our last question to wrap up for the group, how will the board measure the success of the next superintendent and CEO?
I think that success is going to be measured by getting a budget out, steadying our revenues, and even potentially growing our revenues. Is going to be measured by there not being much disruption that principals experience in the operations of their schools. One of the biggest things that we see when there's a transfer of superintendent is that schools have to start all over with how they plan. What we aim to do is steady the ship and move the ship forward.
We could talk about this all day and we'll never have enough time. I want to thank you all so much for the time today. Bridget, Board Member Rhymefest, Board Member Rivas, thank you for your time and valuable insights. On the other side of the break, I'll be joined by a panel of educators to discuss the recently ratified CTU contract and teaching in today's climate. Stay with us.
I'm Felicia Davis Blakely. Joining me on the next edition of In the Arena, a very special guest and dear friend, the 48th Lieutenant Governor of Illinois, Juliana Stratton.
I think when I got to Springfield, I just knew that there was a responsibility. You go into these roles and people are counting on you to make their lives better.
Tuesday at 7 p.m. on CAN TV 19, streaming on cantv.org and the new Plus app.
For more than 40 years, CAN TV has been Chicago's voice, your voice. We've shared your stories, amplified your concerns, and celebrated your triumphs. Now we want to hear from you. What programs matter most? What issues should we cover? How can we better serve your community? Visit cantv.org/feedback today. CAN TV. Experience the power of community television.
Just last month, after nearly a year of negotiations, the CTU and CPS entered into a contract agreement that was ratified by the CTU's members. An overwhelming 97% of teachers voted to approve this agreement, demonstrating the union's strong support for the new terms. The CTU views this contract as a historic victory in the ongoing struggle for educational justice in Chicago, one that will significantly impact both teachers and students. This 11-month battle was very public and culminated with the firing of CPS Chief Pedro Martinez. Joining me for today's roundtable are CPS educators Keishonda Simms, Dara Miller, Layla Truehaft-Ali, and Daniel Jackson to talk about teaching in today's climate, as well as the recently ratified CTU contract. It's great to have you all here today. Let's get right to it. Obviously, nearly a year of seeing the political unfold in front of our very eyes. Teaching in this climate can feel a little bit polarizing at times. I'm curious to hear from our educators. What's it like when negotiations are hyper-focused on the politics, not on the students, and you have to show up for kids every single day?
We try our best to stay out of that because our job is to educate, to ensure children are learning every day. So we try to make sure that we're doing our best at ensuring that the children have the best quality education. And yes, it may be difficult personally on us. However, professionally, we have a job to take on.
I think it's been interesting to hear what gets filtered to children. And so balancing, obviously we're there to learn, right? But sometimes kids come in with questions. I heard this, I'm not sure. One time a kid came in and was like, I heard they're shutting down CPS, right? So I had to back up. But it's important for them to know, and some of them did have questions about the contract or the union, and it's important to explain in an age-appropriate way, not in a way that is putting my opinions out there necessarily, but giving them information, because guess what? In a couple of years, they're going to be voters in the city.
That's right. Yeah, I'm curious, Keishonda, given the role of Teach Plus in the city and the policy and supporting teachers, how do you all feel navigating kind of like, through the political uncertainty and the echo chambers that exist in that space? Do you all take a hard stance approach, or is it truly about just supporting educators in the moment?
At Teach Plus, the biggest thing for us is the advocacy piece for teachers. We do a lot of policy things, we do a lot of practice things. So for us, it's serving teachers so that they are able to more smoothly and comfortably service students. We do a lot of listening to them, what is it that they need, and then responding to that. So teachers are often asked to wear a lot of different hats. They're human beings. So it's often, how can we help you navigate this really difficult space where obviously you may have your own opinions, but you also ultimately have a desire to service the students that you teach every day and the kids in your community. So we kind of try and bridge the gap between where you are and where you could be so you can continue to do your job effectively.
Dara, the new contract includes a number of key provisions, including raises, lower class sizes, and increased prep time. Which of these changes do you think would have the biggest impact on you as an educator?
So I'm in a special situation where I am a teacher at a contract school, and so our union works on a different cycle than our CTU siblings, and our contracts inform each other, right? So a lot of what we're seeing with the CTU contract is really giving us ideas for what we will ask for and advocate for in our new contract. And we're also seeing echoes of what we did in our contract show up in the CTU contract, like the LGBTQ plus protections article. That's something that we worked on at my school, that we helped advocate for. And so really looking at how the CTU contract works within both the public schools and within our charter and contract schools, it's all about support for the students. And so looking at the ways that the CTU contract is supporting the students, and how can we think about how that advocacy work plays across the city.
I'm curious, Layla, from your perspective, of the changes that you're anticipating with the contract, what are things that you're most looking forward to?
I think I am most excited about the addition of clinicians, nurses, school psychologists, social workers. I think right now, the spreading social workers over multiple schools means that often only students with diagnosed disabilities get to work with social workers. And while of course those students need that, there are other students who would also benefit. I always tell the story, when my third week of teaching ever on the job, a child raised her hand and said, I have a stomach ache, and there was no nurse in the building that day. And I didn't know what to do, so I said, well, put your head down, and she threw up on the carpet. So I say that because we are experts in not one thing, but we're experts in the teaching and learning. And when it comes to the physical health, the mental health, we want to do our best, but we're not trained experts. And so having the wraparound staff means that we can all have what we want, which is our students to be healthy and ready to learn.
Daniel, the CTU views this contract as a significant step towards educational justice. I'm curious, how do you define educational justice in the context of your work as a CPS teacher?
Educational justice provides freedom within curriculum. I would say I'm appreciative that the newer contract allows the curriculum to be based on school choice, because teachers have more flexibility to teach the content that tailors to their children's needs. And that's the biggest thing. We went to school to become teachers that have the opportunity to support individual children, not a system. And so looking at individual children, you know that they all have different backgrounds and interests. The teachers are the ones that collect that information at the beginning of the school year. And so I think that having the children or the school choice for curriculum definitely helps to, we'll say, allow children to have more freedom, allow teachers to have more freedom within the educational freedom.
Can I add on to that?
Please.
So in 2022, 2023, I was involved in advocating for the Literacy and Justice for All Act. And I learned so much about evidence-based practice in teaching reading. And towards the end of that school year, my principal said, we're going to select a new reading curriculum. And she did something so incredible. She got all the reading teachers together and she said, research, discuss what is important to you, come to me with recommendations. And because I had that expertise from my advocacy work, I was able to pilot a curriculum. And that meant that we were able to select something that was best for our students. And then there was so much more buy-in for the teachers. So I am so glad that in this contract we have that protection for school choice for curriculum, because I hope other teachers will get that chance to be not just empowered, but more effective because they had that say.
Can I add on as well?
Sure.
So when I think about educational justice, the first thing that I'm thinking about is student safety and student support, because there is no just education without a safe space for learning. So I think that in this climate and under this contract, as we're enhancing supports for students, we're increasing the safe space, we are fostering a sense of community in our classrooms. That is what's going to bring a just education and educational justice true fruition. And to think about how that includes things like the provisions for support for English language learners and students with disabilities, and how everything is just about opening access to learning for our students.
Keishonda, I'm curious, from a nonprofit kind of like partner in the ecosystem, implementing a contract of this size can be complex, and with it also are raised questions just around the district's ability to afford a contract like this in the long term. I'm curious what, if any, concerns you've been hearing from colleagues in the education sector.
I think the biggest thing in the work that we do is just listening to teachers, and some of their biggest concerns is just being able to continue to service their students in the way that's going to continue to move them forward. We hear a lot about the deficits that we're facing right now as far as reading and math and STEM education. Teachers are talking about these things, right? And it's from a perspective where they're wondering how the budget will affect that. And I think it's a really important conversation to continue to include teachers in. I think sometimes teachers get left out of the conversation for different reasons. But that advocacy piece, because a lot of times if parents aren't able to advocate, teachers are able to advocate for their students and the children in their buildings. So I think that's a really important piece of what's going on with the budget right now that might not be being highlighted the way it could be.
I guess to the point on advocacy, and I'm curious to hear, from Layla, you talked a little bit about this. The contract was a result of a long negotiation process. Can you share your perspective on the role of union activism and specifically member participation in achieving this agreement?
So I believe, and I think CTU in this moment is really united behind the belief that our working conditions are students' learning conditions. And so what is good for students is good for teachers and vice versa. So the conversations that were happening with my staff, and we did some events, right? We did a morning where we all got there early and just kind of stood outside the school kind of in support of CTU's negotiations. But we had a lot of conversations within the staff, and I think what we are really thinking about is what is going to make this work sustainable, what is going to allow us to do our best for these children and meet their needs in the whirlwind of different issues that are happening outside. Our biggest concern is at any one time, there are 28 little minds in front of me that all work different ways and little hearts that all have different things, right? And the system creates that sense of, am I going to be able to give them what they need? So that's where the member participation comes in. Super happy that we didn't have to strike because we don't want to be away from our students and we don't want that disruption. So I think having the members involved in a preventative way was also really wonderful.
Yeah, CTU leadership has several times said that we are our best protection, right? And so that feeling of solidarity has come across the whole city, I think, and especially in a time when teaching can be challenging and when teaching as a profession is in the news a lot, right? Thinking about how solidarity empowers us and strengthens our community, both within the teaching staff and within our school communities, with our parents, with our students, and seeing how everyone comes together to really support the school and the student community. That's really powerful.
Daniel, the contract addresses issues like school safety, discipline, student supports. How do you think these provisions are related to areas that will affect your ability to create a positive and productive learning environment for your students?
You said the contract addresses safety?
School safety, discipline, and student supports.
Well, the best practices are coming from relationships with children and the community. Schools have to be taught how to build relationships with the community first, because when you have relationships with the community, the parents, you have less disciplinarian actions that need to be taken, because children are fostering great relationships with their families and teachers. That's something we've done in our classroom and even in our building, built great relationships to decrease the suspensions and in-school suspensions and things like, or detentions. So I would say schools have to have relationships first in order to decrease the amount of disruption that may potentially go on.
I'm curious, to get a teacher's perspective. The spaces that I oftentimes find myself in, people are talking about budget deficits and fiscal responsibility. Obviously, the cost of the CPS contract is going to exceed $1.5 billion over 4 years. What are your thoughts on the financial implications of this agreement? And do you have any concerns about the district's long-term ability to fund these changes? We'll start.
Well, sometimes I have to say we have to advocate a little bit more. That is sometimes above our level. As we said, we're experts in a classroom. There are people in this world who has to advocate for children. Every child should have a librarian. Every child should have a nurse in the school. Every child should have a counselor in the building. We have to advocate for the right things so that our children can have the best. There should not be anyone that goes against the rights of children especially when we know that this world is challenging right now for them. We have to advocate for them in the classroom, but then even right now, we're advocating for our children. But lawmakers too have to advocate. It's surprising to see that lawmakers, because I'm sure many of them do have children, they want to send their children to the best schools. And so all schools should have the best supports for children.
I think It's important to remember that education is an investment in our city, in our state, in our country. It's not to say that these challenges don't exist. I mean, I think we're all a little worried about how the budget is going to affect our school and our students. And in the short term, that's true. But I think what's important to remember is that education prevents so many problems down the line and gives so much, not just, economically, but culturally, civically to our people. And so, yes, there are these budget cuts, but it's also like, do you pull, that's not where you want to skimp, right? Because then you're just kicking the can down the road to more problems that are even more expensive later.
And I will say, before I go to Dara, because I think that your perspective as a charter educator or alternative school educator is interesting here, because, we have seen in charter sector in particular, right, Acero closed their schools for financial reasons. And so, is that something that you'd be concerned about as you gear up for your own kind of as Shy Arts also considers negotiations in the future?
We definitely are always advocating for responsible oversight for the charters in the city, for the contract schools in the city. But we're all here, again, to educate the students and to support the students. And when we're thinking about things like budget deficit gets tossed around a lot, but our students and our school communities are our biggest asset. And we need to make sure that we can support those. And I think that is a citywide concern.
Can I add one more thing? I was thinking of what Keishonda said earlier about teacher voice in the budget. And I think teachers have the ability not just to say what we do need that's really important, but also what we don't need that's not working. And sometimes when we take on new projects and new ideas that are really awesome, we try to keep doing other things that haven't been working. And so I think there's also a role for teachers to say, you know what, that is not super important. It's not that beneficial for students, right? That if you're just in central office, you might think it was. So we're not just uniformly saying more money, more money. We could also be helpful in the other direction too.
I appreciate you sharing that. And I am curious, beyond the specific provisions of the contract, what messages do you hope that this agreement sends to the broader Chicago community? We can do with Keishonda and we'll work our way around.
I think the biggest thing is that if you look at the way things were negotiated, if you think of the way people have been talking about what's going on, everyone is talking about kids first. Yes, there are definite conditions that will make that flourish, and everybody has an opinion, but everybody is really focused on what's going on with kids. And I think that's an important place to just keep highlighted.
Yeah, just the idea that we're on the front line of the protections for our students and the support for our students. And we are here to make a better future for them.
Just that we have to cut through the noise with all the political maneuverings and ideology. We lose sight of what there is evidence and expertise in that benefits children. And so when we're making these hard decisions and having these tough conversations, it has to come down to what do we know works for children. And I think teachers will move mountains if they know that something is going to work for their kids.
Well, education will help transform young lives into adults where we become a part of the productive society. And if we do not make these investments with the best practices that the teachers are stating, we have the alternative that we do not want to have. So it's important that we look at these investments that we are going to make today for a better future.
We could talk about this for hours on end, I'm sure. I appreciate everyone being here tonight. Keishonda, Dara, Layla, and Daniel, thank you for being here today. On the other side of a short break, I'm back with some final thoughts. Stay with us.
Hi,
Hi, I'm financial expert Tamara Durbin, inviting you to join me each week for In the Money, the show that makes money management approachable and enjoyable. Join the conversation at 7 p.m. exclusively on CAN TV Cable Channel 19 or stream live on cantv.org or on the CAN TV Plus app. Elevated conversation and storytelling, experience the power of community television.
Today's robust conversations provided a comprehensive look at the state of education in our city, highlighting both the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead. Our conversation with Daniel underscored the complexities of CPS's budgeting, particularly the tensions surrounding TIF funding and the need for greater collaboration between the city and the school district. As we heard, the financial stability of our schools is paramount to ensuring that every student receives a quality education. Our roundtable discussion with Bridget Lee, Dr. Rhymefest, and Carlos Rivas shed light on the ongoing search for a new CPS superintendent. The debate surrounding the required superintendent's license and the importance of community input reveals the deep passion and diverse perspectives within Chicago when it comes to the leadership of our schools. It's clear, finding a qualified and collaborative leader is crucial for navigating the district's future. Finally, we were joined by CPS educators Keishonda Simms, Dara Miller, Layla Truehaft-Ali, and Daniel Jackson, who offered invaluable insights into the recently ratified CTU contract and the realities of teaching in Chicago today. Their perspectives highlighted the significance of this agreement in addressing key issues such as class size, teacher preparation time, and student supports. As we learned, this contract represents a hard-won victory for teachers and a crucial investment in the future of Chicago students. The dedication and advocacy of our educators, the commitment of community leaders, and the ongoing dialogue surrounding the direction of CPS all point to a city deeply invested in the success of its schools. As Chicago moves forward, it will be essential that all stakeholders continue to work together to ensure that every child has access to a high-quality education. That's all the time we have this week. Thank you for tuning in, Chicago. Until we meet again, be well and well-informed.